Children of the Stones by Jeremy Burnham and Trevor Ray. Chapter 12. Matthew slumped across the table, barely conscious. His father grabbed for him, vowing that this was positively the last time that he would allow the boy to endure the agony of his newfound gift, however urgent the reason. Matthew was pale and trembling in his arms. Adam wiped away the chill of sweat from around his son's eyes. Matthew's brain fought to surface. It's gone. There's a blank, a dark. I can't get through anymore. Adam, despite himself, needed to know more, needed his fears confirmed. His dread forced him to say, try. You've got to keep trying. He loathed himself for the pressures he was putting on his son. The boy shook his head from side to side, his eyes rolling. It's no good. She seems to have stopped feeling. Stopped feeling. Panic hit Adam hard. What's happened to her? Matthew was slipping away towards sleep. He struggled against the tide of weariness, but he could fight no longer. The room began to turn, slowly at first, but accelerating into blackness. His voice whispered in his head. He did not know if his father could hear him. No idea. All I know is she's gone away. We've lost them. The sound of space madness died away into the night, and the section of the ceiling rolled back into place as Hendrik's throne revolved to face the table again. Sandra was the first to stir, but as she pushed herself up from the table, her mother opened her eyes and smiled at her. Hendrik, more affable than ever, smiled upon them with delight. Welcome to you both. How do you feel? He waited. Margaret took a moment to reply. There was something. She felt splendid, complete, but something, some sense of loss tugged at her memory. Nothing important, however. She felt no curiosity about what had happened, about this great and generous man who was her host. Feel. I feel light, powerful, whole, and happy. Hendrik's voice caressed. Happy. Oh, yes. So happy. So happy, echoed Sandra. Of course. Hendrik rose. Now that you have given, now that you are only good, now you can be happy. Now you are happy ones. He held his hands out over their heads as though in blessing. As they gazed up at him rapturously, he declaimed, Go now and take your place. Go now and give your thanks. Go now and be happy. Margaret moved in a dream, floated rather than walked. Her whole being echoed the astronomer's voice as she and Sandra followed Link through the house and into the gardens at the center of the circle. Happy. 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 Surrounding the ancient house was a ring of villagers. Their circle broke as welcoming hands reached out, offering them a place in the line of smiling people. Margaret and Sandra moved through the night to their appointed places, and the circle reformed and continued to rotate to the rhythm of the chant. Adam stared into his coffee. Matthew's recovery had been instantaneous and remarkable. The moment sleep had closed his eyes, he had woken The merest moment of rest had somehow been sufficient to wipe away the effects of his vision. He had recovered his habitual good form and was leaning out of the window, listening to the primordial chant coming from the direction of Hendricks' house. Adam's relief at his son's quick recovery blinded him to the turmoil that still had hold of the boy's mind. Matthew stared into the singing darkness, and he was afraid. This was what his friend the poacher had meant. This was the true time of trouble come upon him. An ache was in his heart for the loss of Di. Very quietly, very much to himself, he called into the night. Softly. Even he could not hear. Di? Where are you, Di? Adam crashed his cup into his saucer and headed for the door. Something must be done about the girls. He could not just sit and wait until things started to happen again. Matthew turned from the window and headed his father off at the door. Dad, you can't... Don't go out there. Out of the way. I just can't sit here. I must know what's going on. Matthew did not move from the doorway. He stared up at his father, puzzled but firm. We know what's going on. Then we must try to help. Adam was close to tears of frustration. Matthew had never seen his father like this before. Adam saw the worry in the boy's eyes and tried to pull himself together. We must try to do something, he said desperately. There's nothing we can do. Nothing we could ever have done. It would have happened anyway. Di told me. Di knew. Di tried to save me, to keep me out of it. Adam saw the pain of loss in Matthew's eyes. Out of what? He demanded. Whatever it is that we're caught in. The boy looked as desperate as his father. Adam moved Matthew physically to one side and wrenched open the door. Driven by his hurt, he risked being callous, anxious to rid his son of what could only be a morbid interest in the dead. Di's gone, Dad. Matt. Gone. Forever. Now it's up to us. He turned to go into the night, but Matthew said quickly, It's too late, Dad. It's happened. We're the only ones left. Suddenly, his son was making sense. The steam went out of his resolve, and he hesitated. It was the silence that relit the fire of his determination. The chanting had stopped. The quiet was more frightening than what had gone before. Adam and Matthew ran through the village, night, toward the sound of silence. Highfield House loomed massively at the center of the circle. The roofs and twisted black chimneys were silvered by the moon. The rest of the pile was dark except for the glow of candlelight high in a window at the top of the house. Crouched beneath the cypress, Matthew whispered, That was the room, the one with the flickering light. As they looked up at the window, the light went out. The house looked dead. Adam touched his son on the shoulder, and they turned and left the grounds of the beautiful but frightening place. As they went, they were watched from a darkened window by the pale, staring face of Link. Dad? Black holes. What about them? Adam's voice cut through the clatter of washing up in the kitchen. Well, Hendricks' supernova. It isn't a supernova anymore. Doing two things at once as usual, Matthew was reading from an astrophysics journal while trying to stack the dishes on the living room table with the other hand. The article was all about Hendricks' supernova, and the magazine was an old one that Matthew had dug out of his father's jumble of a filing system. Adam appeared in the kitchen doorway and eyed the supper plates. Here, give me those. Matthew handed him the stack of dishes, never taking his eyes off the words before him. not even to comment on his father's appearance. Mrs. Crabtree's apron and rubber gloves did very little for Adam's image. "Thanks. Are you going to dry?" Matthew waved the suggestion away. "Later, in a minute. What I mean is, why is it still called Hendrix supernova?" "It's an exploded supernova, isn't it?" "A black hole." His voice died away in puzzlement. "Right. And we all know about supernova. How they are formed. What causes them to explode. But black holes, with their immense gravitational forces, they're still pretty much of a mystery." Adam drifted back into the steamy kitchen. "We know they are there from the pull they have on other nearby bodies, but they're invisible, like some people at washing up." Matthew looked up, worried. "You really are worried about Sandra and Margaret, aren't you?" "What you mean?" "I can always tell when you're really concerned. You make feeble jokes." A wet dishcloth hit Matthew squarely on the ear. Adam stood in the doorway, ripping off the gloves and apron, grave-faced. "They promised to drop in for a nightcap on the way home." The worry was back, multiplied. "They'll come." Matthew pulled on Sandra's scarf from his pocket. "Pity I didn't use something of Margaret's for my psychometric bit. Might have learned more through her than through Sandra." He realized that he was fighting hard to interest his father, to stop him from plunging out again into the danger of the night. Adam shrugged, beset by doubts in every direction. Learned or imagined? Matthew resented his father's tone. "I was right about the supernova, wasn't I?" he protested. "The broken amulet gave me that." Adam paced about, not listening much. He opened the corner cupboard and poured himself a scotch. "And I was right about the doctor. I saw what happened to him the night he left his gloves behind, and the next day he had changed." Matthew was not going to let go easily. "And now the same thing's happened to the girls." The boy looked at his father gravely. "I'm sure it has." "But what? What went on after you lost contact?" Adam leaned across the table and punched the buttons of the tape recorder. The chipmunk noises of the rewind were an accurate rendition of both their thoughts at that moment. Matthew felt the return of the fear as he heard his own voice, taut and stuttering. "Such power. White. Brilliant. Impossible to move. Energy. Force. Sucking. Change. Changing." They stared at each other across the machine, trying to read the meaning in each other's face, seeing only that they were really looking inwardly toward their own minds, the tension that worry can erect around itself. The voices continued. "What's the matter? You okay, Matt?" "It's gone. There's a blank. A dark. I can't get through anymore." "Try. You've got to keep trying." "It's no good. She seems to have stopped feeling." "Stopped feeling? What's happened to her?" "No idea. All I know is she's gone away. We've lost them." Tape hiss was the background to worry and despair, for both of them, as the meaning of the words sank home. Behind them, the street door swung open, and it was the waft of fresh air that made them turn. Framed in the doorway was a smiling Margaret. Adam and Matthew stared at her as though she was a phantom, waiting for the inevitable "happy day" greeting, but dreading that their fears would come true. Margaret's smile faded and a small cloud of concern crossed her face. What's this? A seance? Aren't you going to ask me in? Adam and Matthew whooped with relief. Matthew punched the tape recorder off button and hurried to pour Margaret a drink, while Adam took her hand and led her to the sofa. Oh, am I glad to see you, he started. Correction, grinned Matthew. Aren't we glad to see you? Where's Sandra? Margaret looked at Adam, puzzled slightly by the question. In bed, I imagine. And how was the dinner at the big house? Margaret waved her hand, dismissing the very idea of dinner. Oh, I didn't go. I just had a couple of boiled eggs instead. It was the gentleman's turn to look puzzled. Adam frowned as Matthew chipped in with, You didn't go? But... They looked at each other. Adam plowed on. You haven't been to Hendrick's house. Hope welled even in Matthew's mind. He would be quite happy to be proved wrong if it meant that Margaret and Sandra were unharmed. I don't know anybody who has, said Margaret easily. Apart from you. I was looking forward to it in a strange kind of way. Matthew handed her a brandy and took a scotch across to his father. He studied Margaret covertly. She looked fine. Absolutely normal. Why then did he feel like she was lying? His father was more direct. Margaret, you were both invited to dinner. Why didn't you go? She sipped appreciatively at her brandy and looked over to the rim of the glass at Adam, her gaze steady, savoring the bouquet. Sandra didn't really feel too well. I thought an early night would be better for her, so I sent my apologies to Hendrick. But I couldn't pass up on your kind offer. Could I? She raised her glass to Adam. Cheers. Adam did not respond. Dourly, on the same track, he said, But I don't understand. When you left here, you were on your way to Highfield House. She's been feeling queasy all day. Probably that pop stuff she keeps drinking. Margaret grinned at Matthew. That and the beginning of the cold. It all sounded so possible, particularly as they wanted so much to believe her. Adam's face cleared and the tensions melted. Amazed, but infinitely pleased, he said, So, you really didn't go? Matthew felt it was time he left them to play their grown-up games. Well, he said slowly, that leaves me with egg on my face. He nodded at the tape recorder. Sorry, Dad. Good night. He made his way to the foot of the staircase and stopped, hovering uncertainly. Margaret. I'm glad you didn't go. Really. He stood on one leg, embarrassment growing, wanting to say much more. Margaret seemed to understand. Good night, Nat, she said softly. When he had gone, she turned back to Adam with only the tiniest glance at the tape recorder. What was all that about? Egg on his face. Adam hesitated a moment, then quickly he hit the rewind button on the machine. Listen, he said above the nonsense noise. He stopped the tape and stabbed at the play, beginning back the immediate present, bringing back the immediate past, destroying the present, losing his future forever. Matthew's voice filled the room. Such power. White. Brilliant. Impossible to move. Energy. Force. Sucking. Change. Changing. The truth sprang out of Margaret's eyes. as they suddenly screwed up in pain and stared into another world. The meaning of the flat, forced words gripped her, and she relived some experience beyond his understanding. As she slumped forward, Adam caught her shoulders and managed to kill the description of her agony that the machine was blurting out. He looked down into her suffering face as he headed into his son's. He heard himself say, "Margaret." Twice he said it. The loss was in his voice. Her eyes flicked open, and she smiled palely up at him. She took a moment and then managed, "Don't worry, Adam. I'm all right. I'm perfectly happy." Matthew had been right. They were gone. Mrs. Crabtree came near to thundering as she was able. The morning sun slanted in through the low windows of the cottage and picked out Adam as he tried to shift a case full of electronic gear to a more advantageous spot among the piles of crates and suitcases. "Leaving? What do you mean? I never heard the like." "I'm afraid so, Mrs. C." "But you seemed so set here, working so hard you were, enjoying yourselves." Matthew clattered down the stairs with a grip and some oddments for the baggage pile. The old girl was certainly taking it personally, though, thought Adam. But we'll still need breakfast, Mrs. C. How about one of your specials to speed us on our way?" She turned her full attack on Matthew. "You'll never be leaving, Mr. Matthew. Tell your father. He doesn't want to go. You tell him he can't leave Millbury." Matthew had never liked Mrs. Crabtree, and it was difficult to be polite to her. "I'd like sausages and tomatoes with my eggs and fried bread, and some of that chocolate cake if there's any left." His father looked surprised at these reasonable breakfast demands. Perhaps his son's eating habits were modifying. "Sounds good. Twice, please. You can have my cake, Matt." Mrs. Crabtree shook her head and set off for the kitchen. Matthew waited until the door closed behind her. "My room's packed. Empty, apart from the one thing that we've forgotten." His father licked a label for a crate. "Which is..." He thumped and smoothed it into place. "The thing that brought us here. I'm beginning to think." Adam waited, pen poised. "The painting. Quod non est." "Of course, the painting. It's at the museum. I took it across to show Margaret." Adam's voice tailed away. Matthew held up Sandra's scarf. "Tell Mrs. Crabtree I'll only be 5 minutes. I'll return this at the same time." The astronomer came out of the darkness of the church and stood for a moment, blinking in the bright sunlight. A moment was all that Matthew needed to slip away from the churchyard path and behind the shelter of a great yew tree. Hendrik locked the oak door with some difficulty, for the iron key was heavy and awkward to turn, and he was hampered by the 2 round, flat containers that he was carrying. Matthew could see beyond the porch, almost to the museum, and realized that he was almost trapped in a situation for which he regarded himself ill-suited. Eavesdropping was not exactly his game, but the situation developed too fast for him to do anything about it. For Sandra appeared out of the museum, dressed for school. Seeing Hendrik, she ran forward and tried to help him with his burden, but he laughed away her efforts and stood joking with her for a moment. Although they were too far away to overhear, Matthew could feel the friendship between them, and when Hendrik bent forward and fondly kissed Sandra on the forehead, it was one of the most surprising and dismaying moments of young Matthew's life. Sandra waved a cheerful goodbye to Hendrik, and sped along the path toward Matthew. He even drew farther back into the shadows as she passed, but he couldn't let her go. Without realizing it, he let out a yell. "Sandra!" She stopped and looked back. She obviously could not see him in the shadow of the trees, so he stepped out to her, on the gravel. "Matthew!" Sandra sounded delighted. She hurled back along the path and danced around him excitedly. "Matt! Waiting for me?" Deliberately, Matthew gave his usual greeting. "Hi!" He waited, praying inwardly that she would be as she always had been. Sandra just beamed at him. He had never seen her more pleased with life. This was at our place." He produced her scarf, a bit bedraggled. "I thought I'd return it to you and swap it for my painting." Sandra was delirious when she saw her scarf. It appeared suddenly to become her most treasured possession. "Oh, I looked everywhere." "Thanks, Matt. You can pick up the painting on the way home from school." Hating the lie, Matthew fumbled. "I'm not going to school. I'm taking the day off to help Dad. Is your mother in? I'll get it now." Sandra was already moving away down the path, backwards. No, she's out." "I've got to go. I'll be late." Matthew moved a few steps after her. He must ask, despite himself. "You said the church was locked. Not used. What was Mr. Hendrik doing in there?" Sandra shrugged her satchel into a more comfortable position and tossed her hair back. "Dunno. It's his church." "I must rush." Matthew stopped. It was useless. Almost to himself, he said, "Sandra, goodbye." But she heard him. She smiled at him with love and said confidently, gently, "Not goodbye, Matt. We'll see you soon." And then she was off. Matthew watched her until she was out of sight, taking part of his young life with her. Adam choked on his bacon as Margaret asked, "Where's Matthew?" from the doorway. Warily, he told her that the boy had gone to her place. She smiled and held up the painting. "To get this? I thought he'd forgotten it, so I brought it over." Adam stood and took the picture from her. "Why? Why what? Why did you think he'd forgotten it?" She held his gaze unwaveringly. "Well, he hadn't come to fetch it. And I didn't want to miss you." "You're leaving today, right?" Adam challenged. "Who told you that?" She smiled. "You're not leaving." He had no answer to that. The silence was laden. "Adam, stop playing games. Are you leaving or aren't you?" She sounded genuinely concerned, as though it might make a difference for her. Adam stared at her blindly, all communication lost. He felt tired. "Coffee?" he asked politely, and without waiting for a reply, called to the kitchen. "Another cup, please, Mrs. C." They both listened to the crockery being taken down and the cupboard door sliding shut in the other room. Mrs. Crabtree shuffled and bustled through the door and into their silence. "Master Matthew, is it?" She stopped dead as she saw Margaret. Then, automatically, she switched on the smiling greeting. "Well, I never. Welcome, Mrs. Smythe. How do you feel this morning?" Adam reacted irritably to the facile secretiveness of the question. Was he not supposed to notice its significance? "She feels very happy, Mrs. Crabtree, but she'd feel even happier with a cup of coffee." Mrs. Crabtree ignored Adam's chiding tone and poured the coffee for Margaret, never taking her eyes or her smile off her puzzled face. Adam went cold again as he saw Margaret's face clear of its doubt and respond mechanically to the old body's happiness. She was taking her place in the scheme of things. The church loomed large above Matthew as he searched for a possible entrance. The exterior doors were, of course, locked. The windows, too high to be of any use to an intruder, were not meant to open anyway, but somewhere, he felt sure, there must be a weak spot in the defenses. At the rear of the nave, low down in the wall behind a buttress, he found what he was looking for. Partially obscured by long grass and the overgrowth of ivy was the entrance to the crypt by which coffins were lowered into the vaults. A chute. The only closure, an unbolted swing hinge flap of solid oak. Matthew looked about him to make sure that he was unobserved, then lowered himself into the mossy stone slipway channel and kicked open the heavy door before him. He slid quickly down and out of sight. From behind a tombstone dedicated to the memory of a former villager, Sandra's dark head rose, puzzled at the boy's sudden disappearance. She moved slowly toward the point at which he had crouched down by the great stone buttress. Matthew hit the stone-flagged floor in a heap. Winded, he lay still and listened to the sudden quiet of the crypt. Quiet, but not silence, for over all there was the hum of high-voltage electricity and the quiet chatter of machinery in operation. He raised his head and looked about him. Fixing on the direction of the electronic noises, he pulled himself out of his bruised position and felt his way along the wall, stretching his eyes ahead through the total blackness. The wall stopped and turned at right angles to the sounds. Matthew cast off into the darkness, hands held in front of him protectively, like a sleepwalker. If he'd closed his eyes, he would have seen as much. His fingers found a great curved stone surface. He felt his way to the right along the wall, suddenly realizing that it was no wall but a huge pillar. The gloom broke, and some distance away was not light, but a sort of not dark. Machinery hummed there, and he stumbled across the paving toward it. His hands touched a wall, and moments later, metal cable trunking. The sound came, as far as he could make out, from a bank of computers and related terminals. Following the trunking forward, he discovered that it entered a low tunnel, at the end of which he could make out a dim blue haze. He hurried along the tunnel, eyes fixed on the low light, and blundered into a large mesh metal screen which brought him up sharply. Beyond the screen was a small vault, dimly lit by a low wattage emergency lamp. In the center of the stone cavern, he could just make out more machinery, heavily boxed in and protected. Cables led to and from it, and its working noise was higher pitched, but less obvious than the computer bank. Besides his head, he made out a grill, rather like a ventilation point, but the smell from it was acrid, throat-catching. His eyes started to water, and as he tried to fight back the need to cough, he could feel his lungs exploding. The noise echoed in the dark stone spaces like a series of gunshots, and Matthew turned to get away from the asphyxiating vent. Stumbling blindly back along the low tunnel, his eyes streaming, he could not see that waiting for him was the great figure of Hendrik.